So Nietzsche famously says in his unusual autobiography, Ecce Homo, and also elsewhere in his corpus, that the truth is terrible. And I'd like to begin by canvassing the various considerations in support of that conclusion, both ones that Nietzsche explicitly acknowledged and others offered in a Nietzschean spirit that also supported his verdict. First, for Nietzsche, like Schopenhauer before him, there are the terrible existential truths about the human situation. I don't want to ruin your evening, but the fact is that all of us are destined for oblivion, and that only scratches the surface of the dilemma, though it certainly bears emphasizing, since so much of life is, as Heidegger rightly emphasized, devoted to diverting our attention from us. All of us, will vanish from the world literally. Our sentience and sapience will be extinguished for eternity, and probably figuratively as well, since the likelihood that anyone will be remembered beyond, say, their grandchildren is extremely improbable. And even with regard to that bit of fake immortality being recognized for having existed at some point in the intangible past by grandchildren, one might ask, how could that constitute adequate satisfaction for the insatiable vanities of human life? Not to mention the hyper-vanities of academic life in particular. And should one of us against all odds inherit a century or two worth of readers, while our bodies and our minds are long decomposed and consumed by insects, what matters that? Since all readers, like all authors, are destined for oblivion as well. Not just that of the mortal coil, but also that forecast by astronomers for the cosmic coil. When our sun is extinguished and nothing remains of this college or of Chicago or the United States or the Vatican or Mecca or any other place in which creatures like us are emotionally invested. But many of us in the modern world, even without the benefit of religious consolation, are adjusted, or at least adept at ignoring, the abyss of nothingness that awaits. But that hardly relieves us of the terrible truths of our existential situation. For before all of us and all our loved ones, meaning our dear children and our beloved siblings and spouses and our parents and grandparents, before all of these persons dear to our heart enter oblivion, all will endure to varying degrees physical and psychological misery, mishap, and suffering. We will watch some loved ones die before their time. We will watch others suffer excruciating physical ailments and psychological torments that will diminish their well-being and often their humanity. Some of these horrors will, of course, befall us individually. Examples of the litany of grief that awaits us are all available for regular consumption in the newspapers, a testament to the universality of the afflictions. Cancer, schizophrenia, heart disease, agoraphobia, multiple sclerosis, alcoholism, hip fractures, chronic depression, and on and on. I have no doubt that for everyone listening to this talk, one or more of these afflictions is all too real for them or for someone for whom they deeply care. And to make matters worse, none of these afflictions have any reason or sense or purpose. And then, even bracketing all the physical and psychological hardships that befall creatures like us, there remains the inescapable psychological fact that we all live in a state of constant striving and desire, which is met most often by disappointment and sometimes by momentary satisfaction, only for the cycle to begin anew. We are cursed, as it were, to reenact this pointless routine of striving and disappointment again and again for as long as we remain sentient, constituting the final perverse pointlessness of our existence in Schopenhauer's view. Now, second, there are the terrible moral truths about our situation. Life is something essentially amoral, as Nietzsche says, though I'm using the phrase moral truth somewhat ironically, but in a Nietzschean spirit. For it is precisely his point that reality fails to live up to our moral standards, that it must stand condemned before the bar of morality. The pleasantries and customs of our daily routines soften the hard edges of the terrible truths about our moral situation, but those truths intrude nonetheless. Start only with the most obvious. Hardly anyone, maybe no one, lives in a society that is morally defensible by any existing code of morality that has arisen in the wake of what Nietzsche famously called the slave revolt in morals in his book on the genealogy of morality. He was talking here about the triumph of Christian morality in the Roman Empire in the early hundreds, 2,000 years ago. So take the United States as the example closest to home. In the last decade alone, the United States launched what was, under international law, a criminal war of aggression against a country in the Middle East, one that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands and displaced millions more. Domestically, a plutocratic class with extraordinary riches lords over a political system devoted to its interests, while 50 to 100 million people struggle, sometimes with success and sometimes not, for food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. The existence of elite academics is built upon American aggression against countries rich in resources, and the domestic inequality that sustains the elite universities, including very much my own. There is the obvious blood money that makes American universities the best in the world, but there's the less obvious blood money that flows from living in a nation whose abundance is causally connected to the misery of millions elsewhere. But it's easy enough to bracket the immorality of one's nation, and even some academic moral and political philosophy, as well as lots of economics, especially Chicago School economics, has arisen to assist in that endeavor. Yet that hardly exhausts the terrible truths about the immorality of our existence. For behind the pleasantries and gentle gestures of bourgeois life lie a host of morally distasteful realities, of which the proverbial 7 deadly sins barely scratches the surface. As Nietzsche writes, and here I quote, "Life itself is essentially a process of appropriating, injuring, overpowering the alien and the weaker, oppressing, being harsh, imposing your own form, incorporating, and at least, the very least, exploiting." Though he then objects to the fact that these words have, quote, "been stamped with slanderous intentions from time immemorial." Academic politics instantiates all of these characteristics. I think of the philosophy professor, who shall remain nameless until later at the bar, whose own colleagues call him the will to power incarnate and a sadistic manipulator. But so too does the social milieu of the middle school and the white-collar office. All around us we see manifestations of greed, lust, betrayal, vengeance, and spite in matters banal and momentous. And of course, given the existential truths of our situation, any moral evaluation that takes hedonistic calculations seriously, calculations of pleasure and pain, whether these are, however exactly these are understood, such a calculation is bound to deliver a scathing verdict on the value of our lives. Third, there are the terrible epistemic truths about our situation. And by epistemic, I mean truths about what we can actually know. We may all be destined for oblivion and misery and suffering, and our world, both remote and local, may be awash in immoralities brazen and subtle. But at least we know a few certain things about the world, like what our senses tell us about the immediate environment. Or do we? Although it's tempting to think that I stand at a lectern and you sit on chairs, and that there are several dozen or maybe 100 people in the room, and that all of them have visible properties involving color and smell, physics tells us that this room is in fact full of billions of invisible, odorless, colorless particles, and that from the point of view of our most epistemically robust theories, there are no chairs or lecterns or persons here. Now, Nietzsche, who was hostage to both pre-Socratic metaphysics and 19th century physics, understood this point in terms of what he called the illusion of being, or stable things, when the reality, he thought, was one of constant flux and change. But the basic epistemic point is the same. Ordinary beliefs about the world around us are illusory. Indeed, our ordinary beliefs about ourselves are mostly illusory, and those illusions are essential to our well-being. As psychologists have found, only the clinically depressed typically have an accurate self-perception. That is, one that corresponds to what others actually think. I am enjoying the illusion that you're enjoying the talk. Moreover, Nietzsche is also committed to denying that the first-person perspective in action, in which we take ourselves to be deliberating and free to choose different courses of conduct, he claims this is wholly illusory. Finally, there is the terrible epistemic truth which implicates a moral one, namely that all our moral beliefs, on Nietzsche's view, are based on lies and falsehoods, as he never tired of emphasizing. Well, given the terrible truths about the human situation, it is hardly surprising that Nietzsche took so seriously Schopenhauer's challenge, namely, why prefer life to non-existence? These terrible truths differ, however, in how they inflict their pain. All the terrible truths are terrible if contemplated, if internalized and taken seriously. But some of the terrible existential truths are, of course, constituted by pain and suffering. They are terrible for those undergoing them. I take it that the Schopenhauerian challenge depends primarily on the former rather than the latter. That is, Nietzsche's concern is why we should keep on living given the terrible truths about the human situation, even before the ones constituted by pain and suffering befall us individually. Why keep on living when life promises systematic suffering, immorality, and illusion? Why not accept Schopenhauer's apparent verdict and give up on life altogether? Well, there are relatively few claims about Nietzsche that are uncontroversial, but I hope this one is. Nietzsche was always interested in responding to Schopenhauer's challenge, from his earliest work to his very last. And the animating idea of his response also remains steady from beginning to end, as I shall argue. Namely, and this is how he puts it in the 1886 preface to, he wrote a new 1886 preface to his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, which appeared in 1872. Here's what he says in the 1886 preface: the existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon. And he's here simply echoing famous claims from the 1872 work. Here's an example. He says, it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. This kind of justification, whatever precisely it amounts to, is equivalent in Nietzschean terminology to taking what he calls a Dionysian perspective on life, after the Greek god Dionysus. Here's how Nietzsche puts it again in the new 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy. He says, the book contains an answer to the question, what is Dionysian? And of course, he concludes his final work, his highly stylized autobiography, Ecce Homo, by summing up his life's work by asking, have I been understood? And offering as the answer, Dionysus versus the crucified, where it is clear whose side Nietzsche is on. The Dionysian affirms life, treats it as justified, while the crucified thinks actual life is fundamentally deficient, redeemed, if at all, in an illusory hereafter. As Nietzsche puts it in Twilight of the Idols, one of his last works, and I quote, saying yes to life, even in its strangest and harshest problems, the will to life rejoicing in its own exhaustibility, that is what I call Dionysian. That is the bridge I found to the psychology of the tragic poet. Nietzsche sums up the significance of the idea of the Dionysian in the 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy as follows. And this is number one on the handout, which I hope that most of you have a copy of or a nearby copy of. Here's what Nietzsche says. It was against morality that my instinct turned with this questionable book long ago. It was an instinct that aligned itself with life and that discovered for itself a fundamentally opposite doctrine and valuation of life, purely artistic and anti-Christian. What to call it? As a philologist and man of words, I baptized it not without taking some liberty, for who could claim to know the rightful name of the Antichrist? In the name of a Greek god, I called it Dionysian. Now, for those of you who have not encountered Nietzsche before, you will now realize that he's not a big fan of Christianity. Let me mention, just as a bit of biographical context, that he was the son and the grandson on both sides of Lutheran pastors. So he knew quite a lot about Christianity, and he actually went to university, not with the plan of studying humanities, but of studying theology. Needless to say, he didn't pursue that particular career. And we'll come back to some of his objections shortly. So the Dionysian attitude towards life is purely artistic and anti-Christian, celebrating aesthetic value and illusion and deception, and rejoicing in the destruction of morality, in particular Christian morality, as Nietzsche emphasizes repeatedly in his final works. But in what sense exactly can life be justified aesthetically in light of the terrible truths about the human situation? Now, the word justification in this context is, I think, literally a misnomer. For what is at stake is that life would be experienced as worth living, not that a rational warrant or justification exists for continuing to live. The issue, as it almost always is for Nietzsche, is our affective or emotional attachment to life. And I'll use affect and emotion interchangeably. So the issue is our affective or emotional attachment to life, which the terrible truths, at least when taken seriously, threaten to undermine. The issue is not for Nietzsche whether there are good reasons for continued life. Nietzsche, like the great Scottish philosopher David Hume before him, takes reason to radically underdetermine answers to all the crucial questions. Thus, we need to ask what aesthetic values life might exemplify that would explain how they would enable persons, or at least some persons, to resist Schopenhauer's pessimism. Let's start by supposing that life does in fact exemplify some aesthetic values, whatever they are. We'll come back to that. Why would the aesthetic character of those values be relevant to the attractiveness of life in the face of the terrible truths? Well, let's consider the terrible truths in reverse order. Something can have aesthetic value even if it has no epistemic value. That is, even if it doesn't help us understand the truth. Indeed, on Nietzsche's view, it is the mark of aesthetic value, or one of the marks, I should say, that it lacks epistemic value. Now, that's been a familiar theme in philosophy since Plato. Some of you will know that Plato was very strongly opposed to poetry because he thought it epistemically unreliable. All right? So this is a familiar theme in philosophy since Plato, and it's one Nietzsche repeatedly emphasizes with regard to the Dionysian, though Nietzsche's on the opposite side of this issue from Plato. Indeed, since having epistemic value is often treated as a moral requirement, Nietzsche says in the 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy that Christianity is, quote, the most prodigal elaboration of the moral theme to which humanity has ever been subjected, which he then explains as follows, right? And this is quote number 2 in your handout, right? And think of the Christian idea of the truth shall set you free, right? This is what he's taking issue with here. In truth, Nietzsche says, he's being a little ironic, in truth, nothing could be more opposed to the purely aesthetic interpretation and justification of the world which are taught in this book, meaning Nietzsche's book, than the Christian teaching, which is and wants to be only moral, and which relegates art, every art, to the realm of lies, with its absolute standards beginning with the truthfulness of God. It negates, judges, and damns art. Behind this mode of thought and valuation, which must be hostile to art if it is at all genuine, I never failed to sense a hostility to life, a furious, vengeful antipathy to life itself. For all life, and now Nietzsche is expressing his own view, is based on semblance, art, deception, points of view, and the necessity of perspectives and error. Christianity was from the beginning essentially and fundamentally life's nausea and disgust with life, merely concealed behind, masked by, dressed up as faith in another or better life. Since being able to live depends on illusion, in Nietzsche's view, any moral imperative to know only the truth is necessarily an obstacle to life. He sounds the same theme in Book 2 of The Gay Science, a book he wrote about 10 years after the birth of tragedy. And this is quote number 3 on your handout. Had we not approved of the arts and invented this type of cult of the untrue, the insight into general untruth and mendacity that is not given to us by science, the insight into delusion and error as a condition of cognitive and sensate existence, it would be utterly unbearable. Honesty would lead to nausea and suicide. But now our honesty has a counterforce that helps us avoid such consequences. Art as the goodwill to appearance. As an aesthetic phenomenon, existence is still bearable to us. And art furnishes us with the eye and hand, and above all, the good conscience to be able to make such a phenomenon of ourselves. Nietzsche sustained hostility towards what he calls aesthetic Socratism. This is a label he coins in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy. Right? His hostility is motivated by the same thought, by the thought that it is the mark of the aesthetic, that it welcomes and celebrates illusion as against knowledge, whereas the supreme law of aesthetic Socratism, and here I'm quoting Nietzsche, reads roughly as follows: to be beautiful, everything must be intelligible, as the counterpart to the Socratic dictum, knowledge is virtue. Socrates and Socratic aestheticism thus represent, Nietzsche says, a new and unprecedented value set on knowledge. So much so that, and I quote again, Socrates is the prototype of the theoretical optimist who, with his faith that the nature of things can be fathomed, ascribes to knowledge and insight the power of a panacea, while understanding error as the evil par excellence. Now, for those of you who have read Richard Dawkins, you can think of Nietzsche here as talking about someone like Richard Dawkins, though he shares Richard Dawkins' atheism. But we can come back to that in discussion. So since the truths about the world are terrible, indeed life-threatening, Socratic optimism stands reality on its head in Nietzsche's view. The opposition between aesthetic and epistemic value is strikingly summed up by Nietzsche in the third essay of his on the genealogy of morality, a book he wrote very late in his career. This is quote number 4 on your handout. Here he says, art in which precisely the lie hallows itself, in which the will to deception has good conscience on its side, explains why Plato, with his Socratic optimism, is, quote, the greatest enemy of art that Europe has yet produced. Plato contra Homer. That is the complete, the genuine antagonism. Okay. Now, second, we're still considering why, if life had aesthetic value, that would have any bearing on the terrible truths. Something can have aesthetic value even if it lacks moral value. We've already seen it can have aesthetic value without epistemic value. So something can have aesthetic value even if it lacks moral value, unless one held the implausible view, and Nietzsche surely doesn't hold it, that immorality defeats aesthetic value. That is, that an immoral piece of art could nonetheless be beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. The Greek myths illustrate the point for Nietzsche. Anyone, he says, who, quote, approaches these Olympians with another religion in his heart, and Nietzsche's obviously alluding here to Christianity, and is thus looking for, quote, moral elevation, for charity and benevolence, will soon be discouraged and disappointed, since, quote, there is nothing here in the Greek myths that suggests asceticism, spirituality, or duty. We hear nothing but the accents of an exuberant, triumphant life in which all things, whether good or evil, are deified. Now, what does he mean here? Well, the Greek myths delight and engage us. That's why you still study them in the humanities program here and elsewhere. But they delight and engage us not in virtue of providing moral uplift, but rather celebrating the exuberant, triumphant life of the Olympians, who are thoroughly immoral in their licentiousness, their vengeance, and their delight in cruelty and violence. Well, what about the terrible existential truths? How could the fact that life exemplifies aesthetic value restore our attachment to life in the face of the terrible existential truths about our situation? I want to start by recalling a very different version of this question that Nietzsche takes up in the third essay of his book on the genealogy of morality. And the question is this, namely, how does the ascetic ideal, and by the ascetic ideal he sums it up, he says the three catchwords of the ascetic ideal are poverty, chastity, humility, right? And what he's interested in here is the phenomenon that all the world's major religions set up a moral ideal that involves some kind of self-denial, right? Whether it's denial of the sexual instincts, denial of the lust for wealth or power or whatever, they all have an ascetic component to them. And his question is, how does the ascetic ideal taught by those he calls the priests, though this is not specific to the Catholic religion, how does this ascetic ideal seduce the majority of mortals? And Nietzsche refers to the majority of mortals as the physiological casualties and disgruntled. Okay? That's us, I'm afraid. How does this ideal seduce the majority of mortals back to life? And now Nietzsche says suffering itself was not the problem. The problem was the meaning of suffering. Suffering for what? In short, he says, and this is again from the genealogy, the meaningless of suffering, not the suffering, was the curse which has so far blanketed mankind. So what makes the terrible existential truths about the human situation terrible is precisely that they are utterly meaningless. For the majority of mortals, the teaching of the ascetic ideal, Nietzsche thinks, gives those terrible truths a meaning, but a meaning of a particularly perverse kind. It explains their suffering falsely, in Nietzsche's view, as a consequence of their own moral inadequacy, their own failures to live up to ascetic ideals, and thus at least allows them to discharge the ressentiment. Now, ressentiment is a term of art Nietzsche uses to refer to a kind of stewing hatred that sort of wells up when someone is suffering or in an unpleasant condition. Right? It allows people to discharge the ressentiment that suffering produces, although in this case, against themselves. And let me just fill out this picture a little because I'm glossing over a rather complicated issue in Nietzsche here. His idea is this, which is that the world's major religions set up an ideal about how you should live, right? Chastity, poverty, humility, okay? You shouldn't desire sex, you shouldn't desire wealth, you shouldn't desire recognition, fame, and so on. You should be chaste, poor, and humble, right? Nietzsche thinks no one can live this way, right? That in fact everybody has sexual desires, desires for power, desires for wealth, right? But insofar as you teach people that this is the ideal they should live up to, this is the ideal set by their God, then people, and now this is the important point, Nietzsche thinks everyone suffers as a matter of course. That was the point of the terrible existential truth. People are suffering anyway, but now they can make sense of it. They say, oh, now I know why I'm suffering. I'm a sinner because I didn't live up to the ideals that were taught by my religion. That's his basic idea in the third essay of the genealogy. Right? And once they realize that, or once they come to believe, falsely, he thinks that they're the cause of their own suffering because they didn't live up to the moral teachings of their religion, they can then direct their anger at themselves as a sinner. Right? I'm responsible for my own misery because I'm such a sinful person. Yeah? And here's the key mechanism, right, which Nietzsche thinks is at work here. And this is number 4 on your handout. Okay? Every sufferer instinctively seeks a cause for his suffering. Still more precisely, a perpetrator. Still more specifically, a guilty perpetrator who is receptive to suffering. In short, some living thing on which, in response to some pretext or other, he can discharge his affects in deed or in effigy. For the discharge of affect is the sufferer's greatest attempt at relief, namely at anesthetization, his involuntarily craved narcotic against torment of any kind. It is here alone, according to my surmise, that one finds the true physiological causality of ressentiment, of revenge, and of their relatives. That is, in a longing for anesthetization of pain through affect. One wishes by means of a more vehement emotion of any kind to anesthetize a tormenting secret pain that is becoming unbearable, and at least for the moment, to put it out of consciousness. For this, one needs an affect as wild an affect as possible, and for its excitation, the first best pretext. All right? So the idea is to surprise a pretext that will excite an affective or emotional response, and that powerful emotional response will anesthetize the basic pain that the individual is undergoing because of his or her suffering. Well, the pretext at issue in the case of the ascetic ideal, right, is that you yourself are to blame for your suffering because you failed to live up to the ascetic ideal. Therefore, the affects of revenge are aroused against the sufferer himself. But, and this is crucial, powerful affects act, according to Nietzsche, as narcotics that relieve pain. The meaning the ascetic priest supplies makes suffering bearable because it anesthetizes the suffering through arousal of the affects associated with ressentiment and revenge. The meaning that interests Nietzsche, which remember is a restoration of our affective or emotional attachment to life, is not expressed in a propositional content, but rather derives from the arousal of the affects, which then allows the majority of mortals to resist suicidal nihilism. Because Nietzsche thinks if suffering has no meaning, everyone will be driven to suicidal nihilism. Now, this, I take it, and the reason I've belabored it, is Nietzsche's paradigm of a so-called justification of suffering. It's certainly the one he explores at greatest and most systematic length, and the key fact about it is that it turns on the causal mechanism of a psychological process. The arousal of affects acts as a narcotic that relieves pain. Now, as a matter of empirical psychology, this turns out to be very plausible, but I'm happy to talk about that in discussion. Now, Nietzsche, to be clear, considers this particular response to the terrible existential truths perverse, since it's one that ultimately exacerbates human suffering. Here's how he puts it also in the third essay, The Genealogy, and this is number 5 on your handout. To free the human soul from all its moorings for once, to immerse it in terror's frost, blazes and ecstasies in such a way that it is freed from everything that is small and small-minded in listlessness, dullness, being out of sorts, as if by a bolt of lightning. Which paths lead to this goal, and which of them most surely? Basically, all great affects or emotions have the capacity to do so, assuming that they discharge themselves suddenly. Anger, fear, lust, revenge, hope, triumph, despair, cruelty. And indeed, the ascetic priest has unhesitatingly taken into his service the whole pack of wild dogs in man and unleashed first this one, then that one, always for the same purpose, to waken man out of slow sadness, to put to flight, at least for a time, his dull pain, his lingering misery, always under a religious interpretation and justification. Every such emotional excess exacts payment afterwards. That goes without saying. It makes the sick sicker. In other words, arousing these strong affects, resentment that the sufferer feels towards himself because he thinks of himself as a sinner, ultimately makes the individual worse off, right? Because you have all the suffering now that goes along with your sense of guilt that you're a sinner, that you brought your misery on yourself, and so on. So it does so because the ascetic priest exploits the emotions surrounding guilt and resentment aimed at itself, feelings which induce new suffering even as they anesthetize the earlier pain. Now, Nietzsche is explicit that art achieves what the ascetic ideal achieves, namely, and I quote, seducing one to a continuation of life. But if art does not supply a fictional explanation for the cause of suffering, as the ascetic ideal does, how does it do so? How does art restore affective or emotional attachment to life? That's now our central question. We can't answer that question without first answering a different one, namely what Nietzsche thinks aesthetic value and the appreciation of aesthetic value involves. Once again, we can take our cue from an observation in The Birth of Tragedy, his 1872 book, which affirms the central role of aesthetic experience in counteracting suicidal nihilism. Nietzsche writes, and I quote, "The truly serious task of art is to save the eye from gazing into the horrors of night and to deliver the subject by the healing balm of illusion from the spasms of the agitation of the will." And similarly, he says that tragic insight into the terrible existential truths, needs art as a protection and remedy in order merely to be endured. So how does aesthetic experience provide this protection and remedy? How does it deliver the subject of these terrible existential truths? How does it deliver him by the healing balm of illusion? Now I'm going to skip over a discussion of the answer Nietzsche actually gives in The Birth of Tragedy, because it's based on certain views of Schopenhauer's about the metaphysical nature of the world that Nietzsche comes to reject. Right? I'm happy to talk about it if people are interested. I want to skip over to what I take to be his later and, shall we say, mature view about this question. So Nietzsche's own account of aesthetic experience is, not surprisingly, articulated in opposition to Immanuel Kant's, most clearly in the third essay of the genealogy. Kant makes two kinds of mistake in Nietzsche's view, one about art and the other about knowledge. Nietzsche writes, now I quote, "Kant intended to honor art when among the predicates of the beautiful he privileged and placed in the foreground those that constitute the honor of knowledge, impersonality and universal validity." That is, Kant claimed that in genuine aesthetic appreciation, our appreciation of the artwork is disinterested, it's impersonal, it doesn't reflect some personal interest or emotional investment we have in it, and it has a kind of universal validity. That is, if something is genuinely beautiful, then the fact that I appreciate it as beautiful means all of you ought also to appreciate it as beautiful. Okay? And in this regard, aesthetic appreciation was a lot like knowledge on Kant's view, and Nietzsche wants to say it's wrong in both cases. Right? Impersonality and universal validity are marks of neither art nor knowledge, on Nietzsche's view. And this is a central aspect of the doctrine he calls perspectivism. Indeed, Nietzsche ridicules Kant's idea that the mark of aesthetic experience is that it, quote, "pleases without interest." And Nietzsche endorses instead Stendhal's formula, the great French writer, namely that the beautiful promises happiness. That's Stendhal. That is, it produces, and now this is Nietzsche's gloss on Stendhal, right? The beautiful produces the arousal of the will, the arousal of interest. Nietzsche soon makes the connection between aesthetic and sexual arousal even more explicit a little bit later in the genealogy. Here's what he writes. "The peculiar sweetness and fullness characteristic of the aesthetic condition," he says, "might have its origins precisely in sensuality, though it is now transfigured and no longer enters consciousness as sexual stimulus. Of course, it is the hallmark of actual aesthetic experience, if it's the hallmark of actual aesthetic experiences that they arouse the will, and are marked by the sweetness and fullness associated with sensuality, and even in sublimated form sexual satisfaction, then it seems like aesthetic experience can tap into the mechanism identified in the genealogy, namely the anesthetization of pain through affect, through the arousal of affect. Or, as he puts it later, also in the genealogy, excess of the emotions, which are the most effective means of anesthetizing the dull, paralyzing, long painfulness. Could it be then that art justifies life, and I put justifies in quotes, and strictly it's a misnomer, in the sense of restoring our affective attachment to it through essentially pleasurable, quasi-sexual affective arousal? And if it does so, does it also, like the ascetic priest's arousal of resentment and guilt, make the sufferer worse off? That Nietzsche in his later work views aesthetic experience as essentially pleasurable in a way that is on a continuum with sexual pleasure is very difficult to deny. Here, for example, is Nietzsche in one of his last works, Twilight of the Idols, noting that the element at the root of Dionysian art is the orgiastic rite. And he continues, this is number 6 on your handout. The fundamental fact of the Hellenic instinct, its will to life, expresses itself only in the Dionysian mysteries, in the psychology of the Dionysian state. That is why the sexual symbol was inherently venerable for the Greeks, the truly profound element in the whole of ancient piety. It was Christianity with its fundamental ressentiment against life that first made sexuality into something unclean. It threw filth on the origin, the presupposition of life. This exact same theme continues in his very last work, which has the memorable title, The Antichrist, where in a wild declamation against Christianity at the end of the book, he includes as one of the 6 offending Christian doctrines its endorsement of chastity. And then he adds, and now in Nietzsche's own voice, that contempt for sexuality is the real sin against the Holy Spirit of life. Well, Nietzsche as sexual hedonist, indeed any kind of hedonist, has not been a dominant theme in the scholarly literature on Nietzsche. But Nietzsche's relation to hedonism, right, the idea that pleasure is good, is complex, even though he plainly rejects the idea that pleasure is the only good, let alone the only motivator of human action. And he in no way endorses the idea that there is a rational justification for existence based on a hedonic calculation. But he does object against Kant, again in this last work, The Antichrist, and here I quote, that when the instinct of life compels us to act, pleasure proves that the act is right. That's Nietzsche. And Nietzsche adduces Kant's denial of this point as evidence that, and I quote again, Kant became an idiot. Okay? Something that makes Nietzsche a pleasure to read, but a little unpopular with philosophy instructors. And one could well agree with Nietzsche that people welcome suffering, indeed seek it out contrary to the hedonist as long as it has a meaning. Our question is only how aesthetic experience supplies that meaning. Remembering, of course, that meaning in this context means a psychological mechanism that restores and maintains our emotional attachment to life despite the terrible truths. And the answer seems to be that aesthetic experience is arousing, that it produces a sublimated form of sexual pleasure, and it is surely constitutive of a pleasurable experience, sexual or otherwise, that it attracts us. I will refer to this as the minimal hedonic thesis, according to which pleasurable experience draws us towards its object rather than away from it. That is, of course, compatible with other motivations dominating the minimal hedonic one, and also compatible with objects incompatible with hedonism also attracting us. But the hypothesis on offer is that, in accordance with this minimal hedonic thesis, aesthetic experience produces affective arousal sufficient to thwart the nihilistic impulse, the impulse to give up on life because of the terrible truths about it. Well, this claim raises at least 2 key questions. First, is it plausible that aesthetic experience satisfies the minimal hedonic thesis? Second, even if it does, is the attraction associated with the minimal hedonic thesis really enough to thwart suicidal nihilism? On the first issue, we may reasonably wonder whether there is a continuum of distinctive psychological states that runs from sexual ecstasy to the final movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Certainly, sexual pleasure appears to satisfy the minimal hedonic thesis, as evidenced by the fact that no one, to my knowledge, has ever chosen to give up on life during a sexual experience. But if sexual pleasure satisfies the minimal hedonic thesis, what about aesthetic pleasure? No doubt someone somewhere has extinguished his life while listening to Beethoven, but surely it remains plausible that intense aesthetic experience draws one towards life. As Nietzsche puts it, in the Dionysian state, the entire system of affects is excited and intensified. And he adds, and I quote again, music, as we understand it today, is a total stimulation and discharge of the affects. Even the herd and the rabble, that's how Nietzsche refers to most people. All right? Nietzsche is a bit of an illiberal fellow. Even the herd and the rabble have their version of this experience in the modern rock and roll concert, in which the pulsating and escalating rhythms and repetitive musical motifs mimic those of sexual arousal and orgasm. In a recent interview, the American rock and roll star Bruce Springsteen, untutored in Nietzsche, I want to add, right, observed that he wanted audience members to leave his concert, and now I quote Springsteen, with your hands hurting, your feet hurting, your back hurting, your voice sore, and your sexual organs stimulated. The musical work of genius like Beethoven's is presumably more sublimated and also more intense on this score, yet it seems natural to think that joy correctly describes the experience of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Whatever the psychological plausibility of the Nietzschean hypothesis on offer, there remains, however, a different worry. Namely, as Nietzsche argues in the genealogy, intense arousal of the affects can make one worse off, even as it anesthetizes the pain of the terrible truths. But the effective arousal characteristic of sex and art, on Nietzsche's view, is surely different than that induced by the teaching of the ascetic ideal. For the latter gives rise to ressentiment directed against the sufferer, as well as guilt experienced by the sufferer, both of which quite clearly induce new rounds of suffering in its subject. But the sweetness and fullness, as he calls it, of aesthetic experience seems rather different. It's one for which the metaphor of seduction seems especially apt. Intoxication, or Rausch in German, is Nietzsche's other preferred metaphor for it. And here's an example from, again, Twilight of the Idols, one of his works of his last year. This is number 7 on your handout. Without intoxication to intensify the excitability of their whole machine, there can be no art. Above all, the intoxication of sexual excitement, the most ancient and original form of intoxication. There is also an intoxication that comes in the wake of all great desires, all strong affects, an intoxication of the festival, the contest, of the bravura of performance, of victory, of all extreme movement, the intoxication of cruelty, intoxication in destruction, or under the influence of narcotics. The essential thing about intoxication is the feeling of fullness and increasing strength. Now, the characterization of intoxication in terms of the feeling of fullness and increasing strength obviously echoes the characterization of aesthetic experience from the genealogy that we noted earlier. In both cases, the experience stimulates what we might call feelings of aliveness, counteracting, therefore, the depressant effect of the terrible truths about existence. Art is the great stimulus to life, as Nietzsche says in Twilight of the Idols, but it does so in the same basic way that sexual arousal and intoxication do, by creating certain powerful feelings with a positive valence, feelings that stimulate the subject and erase, or at least overwhelm, any awareness of the actual realities of the human situation, what he called in The Birth of Tragedy the healing balm of illusion. But how could arousal and intoxication, the healing balm of illusion, give rise to affirmation of life, to the willingness to will the repetition of all suffering for eternity? Many of you may have heard that Nietzsche thought the test of whether you really would affirm life is whether you would will its eternal return, that you would will to repeat every aspect of your life again and again into eternity, and no editing, right? All the awful parts, all the good parts. To affirm life, in his view, is to be willing to have it all again and again and again through eternity. Well, one possibility is that the seductive quality of the arousal and intoxication is so great that one wants it despite the fact that it means a repetition of the suffering as well. But if that were all affirmation required, then it would be compatible with excising, editing out the suffering, in favor simply of preserving the hedonic element. And that picture seems in tension with Nietzsche's idea that in a Dionysian view of life, one does not view suffering as an objection to life. Here's how he puts it in his autobiography. Pain is not considered an objection to life. That's the ideal here. Earlier in his career, Nietzsche describes eternal recurrence as, quote, the ideal of the most high-spirited, alive, and world-affirming human being who has not only come to terms and learned to get along with whatever was and is, including suffering, but who wants to have what was and is repeated into all eternity. If an affirmative attitude towards life is one in which one gladly wills its repetition, including all its suffering, not despite the suffering, right, then the bomb of illusion metaphor from his early work, The Birth of Tragedy, is misplaced, at least in his later work. What Nietzsche has to show is a necessary connection between the suffering and the arousing and intoxicating qualities of aesthetic experience. If they are necessarily connected, then the seductive appeal of the latter, the arousing and intoxicating qualities, will bring within its ambit the former, the suffering. I'll return to this in a moment. It may also seem that I've elided one other important point in both the passage from Twilight of the Idols that I've been discussing and also in Nietzsche's criticism of Kant's aesthetics from the genealogy. In the Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche is actually describing Rausch, intoxication, as a necessary condition for the artist, not for the consumer of the artistic product. And in the genealogy passage that I discussed earlier, he faults Kant not only for thinking aesthetic experience is disinterested, but also for mistakenly focusing on the consumer or spectator rather than the creator of art. Here's how Nietzsche puts it in the genealogy. Quote, Kant, like all philosophers, instead of envisaging the aesthetic problem starting from the experiences of the artist, the one who creates, thought about art and the beautiful from the viewpoint of the spectator. But as we've already seen, Nietzsche also charges Kant with misunderstanding the spectator's aesthetic experience, which turns out, on Nietzsche's view, not to be different from the artist's. Both involve Rausch, or a kind of sensual arousal. Indeed, when Nietzsche invokes Stendhal's view that the beautiful offers a promise of happiness, he describes the French author as, quote, a real spectator and artist. Both spectator and artist are united then in that both genuine appreciation and genuine creation have, on Nietzsche's view, a strong component of Rausch. Rausch, however, seems to get us only what the scholar Tamsin Shaw aptly calls obliviousness to the terrible truths. Yet, as she remarks, and I quote, this kind of experience can only be available to humans as an extraordinary and transient state. And she adds, the luxury of living this way, quote, is only available as a way of life to those who live off the labor of others, though that fact would have hardly bothered Nietzsche. But the more pressing challenge for Nietzsche is this. If aesthetic pleasure is transient in the way Shaw describes, how can it restore affective attachment to life as a whole? Most drunks love life, but what happens when they sober up and realize the terrible truths about existence? The answer must be that Nietzsche envisions forms of life whose aesthetic qualities are not transient, but pervasive features of the social world. Is that plausible? Well, let's reframe the question. What aesthetic value could life exemplify such that it produces the pleasurable affect of Dionysian ecstasy that sustains our attachment to life not transiently or temporarily, but across time? Here, I think, is the crucial connection with Nietzsche's critique of morality as I explicated it in my 2002 book. Now here I'm just going to summarize, but we can talk more about it in discussion. According to Nietzsche's critique, in a culture in which moral norms predominate, nascent creative geniuses like Goethe and Beethoven, Nietzsche's two favorite examples apart from Nietzsche himself, nascent creative geniuses like Goethe and Beethoven will not realize their potential. Right? Nietzsche's idea is that the moral demands of altruism, of pity, of egalitarianism are actually incompatible with the kind of life that artistic geniuses actually lead. Right? And if you've ever read a biography of Beethoven, you know this is certainly apt with respect to Beethoven. So if Goethe's and Beethoven's fail to realize their potential, right, because they take morality too seriously, then we shall be deprived of what I'll call the spectacle of genius. That is, the spectacle of human achievement that induces aesthetic pleasure, whether in the clearly aesthetic realm, for example, Beethoven, or on the historical stage. For example, Napoleon, who was a very popular 19th century exemplar of the idea of genius. Life without music is a mistake, Nietzsche famously says in an aphorism from a late work, and the point can be generalized. Life without the spectacle of genius could not arouse aesthetic pleasure, and so would deprive us of a justification for existence in the particular psychologized sense of justification I've already mentioned. And the spectacle of genius produced by a Beethoven or Napoleon is not transient and momentary, but all-encompassing, defining the character of existence for its time. One lives in the age of Beethoven or the age of Napoleon. And now notice that for both prototypes of the spectacle of genius, Beethoven's and Nietzsche's, suffering is actually essential. In Beethoven's case, it was an essential precondition on Nietzsche's account of his creative achievement. And for Napoleon, it was essential to the achievements themselves that they inflicted suffering. If these spectacles of genius attract us to life and lead us to affirm it, they are at the same time inseparable from suffering. Nietzsche, I take it, thinks that his rightful readers will see the essential connection and so gladly affirm it all. But who are Nietzsche's rightful readers in this context, those who require the kind of justification that spectacles of genius provide? Nietzsche is rather explicit that the vast majority of humanity has already been seduced back to life by other narcotics, perverse as some of them, like the ascetic ideal, are. But not all of them are so perverse, since there are many what Nietzsche calls innocent means of anesthetizing the pain of existence. Here's quote number 8 on your handout from the genealogy. These are his examples of the non-guilty, the innocent means of anesthetizing pain. The general muffling of the feeling of life, mechanical activity, drudgery, the small joy, above all that of love of one's neighbor, the herd organization, the awakening of the communal feeling of power, whereby the individual's vexation with himself is drowned out by his pleasure in the prospering of the community. These are, measured according to a modern standard, the innocent means in the battle with listlessness. One need only listen to the rhetoric of an American presidential election to realize how pervasive these narcotics are. And given the evidence that mass suicide is not breaking out, one might think these narcotics are working rather well. It is one mark of Nietzsche's genius, I think, that he diagnoses this widespread phenomenon. Well, perhaps then the real audience for the aesthetic pleasure associated with the spectacle of genius is not the vast herd of humanity, for whom Nietzsche has the most extraordinarily illiberal contempt, but rather those higher human beings, as Nietzsche calls them, for whom the perverse narcotics like the ascetic ideal and the innocent narcotics that I just described are wholly incredible or ineffective. In other words, it's directed at those who can actually reflect seriously on the terrible truths about human existence, but who still need, in the end, some seducing back to life. This would be people who study the humanities. It is, after all, as Nietzsche says, the higher human beings, right, who, quote, distinguish themselves from the lower by seeing and hearing more and doing so more thoughtfully. Now, if that's right, notice that the fate that befalls the rest of humanity is not of great significance to Nietzsche. Imagine if the herd, the great masses, were to succumb to suicidal nihilism while the Beethovens and Goethes and their appreciative audience were to survive and their material needs be met. Is there any reason to think Nietzsche would object? Well, how could he, consistent with his notorious statement in The Antichrist, this is the kind of thing people don't like to quote from Nietzsche, where he says, the weak and the failures should perish first. Indeed, they should be helped to perish as, quote, the first principle of our love of humanity. Not a nice sentiment. I take it the thought here, and in other sections of The Antichrist, is that the spectacle of the pathetic herd of humanity is itself a kind of aesthetic blot on existence, an obstacle to full enjoyment of the spectacle of genuine human excellence. Nietzsche was, of course, read by both admirers, like the Danish critic Georg Brandes, who first introduced him to European audiences in the late 19th century. So he's read by Brandes, but also by critics, including legions of communists, as a friend of the aristocratic order. In a somewhat perverted form, he was also so read by Nazis, though with aristocracy given a racial interpretation for which there is no support in Nietzsche's writing. Nietzsche, as any reader of his corpus know, hated Germans above all. These readers were no doubt wrong in many particulars, but they were not wrong, I suspect, about the deeply illiberal character of Nietzsche's response to Schopenhauer's challenge. His question was how the highest human beings, those most attuned to the terrible truths about existence could maintain their effective allegiance to existence. And his answer was that they required the enticement of the spectacle of genius, a spectacle incompatible with the triumph of ascetic moralities over the past 2,000 years. Thank you.